Lebanon's health ministry says at least 50 people have been killed and more than 300 wounded in fresh Israeli attacks. Israel's military earlier began carrying out what is described as extensive strikes against Hezbollah, telling residents to evacuate areas close to buildings that are used by the militant group. The new wave of airstrikes on Lebanon follows a weekend in which both sides exchanged hundreds of rockets. Some struck close to the Israeli port city of Haifa. Israel's defense minister says the operations will continue until residents can return to evacuated areas near the northern border with Lebanon. Hezbollah has said it will fight on until a ceasefire is secured in Gaza. Now, for the latest from both sides, I'm now joined by our correspondent Tania Krämer in Haifa, which is just 40 kilometers from the Lebanese border, and Mohamad Chreyteh in Beirut. Mohamad, let's start with you. Fresh strikes within Lebanon. What are you hearing?
This front is heating up really fast. A fresh wave of Israeli airstrikes hit positions in southern Lebanon and the Bekaa region a while ago. The Ministry of Public Health just announced that at least 50 were killed and more than 300 wounded in the Israeli airstrikes today. This is only an initial count. Image coming from the south UGC videos show houses in populated districts turned into ruins. Many Lebanese have been receiving automated calls reportedly from Israel asking them to leave their positions. The Minister of Information is said to be one of those who received similar calls. At least 80,000 calls have been spotted, said the head of Lebanon's telecom operator. You know, this confrontation is clearly in a new stage, in a new phase of heavy cross-border shelling, and it appears that this will gradually increase in the coming few days as the front appears to be in a deadlock. Israel wants to return tens of thousands of Israeli evacuees back to the north. Hezbollah says they won't be back unless a ceasefire is agreed upon in Gaza. And here we are. There's fears of increasing tension that would lead to an all-out war here in Lebanon.
Tania in Haifa, what more can you tell us about Israel's plans?
Well, as we just heard, I mean, the military here has or is being intensifying its strikes in southern Lebanon, and they had called on residents there in southern Lebanon, at least as they put it here, those close in proximity to Hezbollah military targets to leave. And we can hear here in Haifa the constant coming and going of fighter jets in the air. So since this morning, and this number, of course, is changing by the minute and by the hour, the army has said they have targeted about 300 targets or sites in southern Lebanon. And this is, of course, ongoing. There have also been air raid sirens going off towards the Sea of Galilee and places towards the eastern Galilee, also the lower Galilee. And we understand that about 25 rockets in one of the barrages were fired. The air defense system has intercepted some of them, and others were falling in open areas. But we also hear there's some lightly injured, usually when shrapnel is falling down or when people are running to the shelters.
Tania, this escalation has authorities in northern Israel, where you are right now, on high alert, of course. And most places there must look like ghost towns. What does it look like in Haifa, for example?
Well, Haifa is here the biggest city in northern Israel. It's also a port city, but of course it has not been evacuated like other places, like near the border, up to 5 kilometers from southern Lebanon. Those people have been actually residing in hotels or in other places, in apartments, for over a year now. And this is what has been stressed by the government. This situation cannot continue now. Of course, people I've been talking talking to this morning here in Haifa, they're saying they're worried about it. And you can see the city is much, much calmer. You know, people going to get some shopping done, and they're now waiting what is there to happen, because with a message to Lebanon that the military is intensifying their strikes, the defense minister here has said to the Israeli public, these will be challenging days ahead, and that they should be very careful listening to the home front command guidelines. This is usually what's given out to people, you know, where they should be, if they should be next to bomb shelters. And this comes also, well, there are reports here in the Israeli media that they're expecting the range of the rockets, possibly by Hezbollah, maybe to be expanded, as are the strikes possibly in southern Lebanon might expand.
Mohamad, in Beirut, this is not the first time violence has broken out on this level between Israel and Hezbollah. If we're talking about the average Lebanese people, what's the mood?
Well, we're seeing more people evacuating the southern towns, including major cities like Tyre, which was not hit heavily before like it was today, as the confrontation is violently escalating. People are driving to Beirut and northwards. There's more than 100,000 people had already left their homes in southern Lebanon and are taking refuge in Beirut and across the country in the mountains. This is really disrupting lives in Lebanon, again, on so many aspects. School classes are interrupted. We heard about families picking up their children from schools here in Beirut. The Minister of Education just said a while ago also that schools will be shut down today and tomorrow in the south and in the Beqa regions. Hospitals are working at utmost capabilities. You know, Lebanon have gone through a very volatile week last week after Hezbollah device explosions and the Israeli airstrike on southern suburbs of Beirut late last week. Now fears are really growing that this escalation continue to increase in intensity and targeted territory and geography, and namely in Beirut and the southern suburbs of Beirut.
Many thanks there to our correspondents Tania Krämer in Haifa and Mohamad Chreyteh in Beirut. Now let's cross next to Makram Rabah. He's in Beirut as well. He lectures in history at the American University there. Makram, considering recent developments and rhetoric from both sides, how severe do you expect Israel's announced strikes to be?
Well, it is clear that the Israelis are trying to push the envelope by forcing Hezbollah to announce its defeat in a way. It has systematically started to bomb on a larger scale many of the villages which extend beyond the so-called border villages with Palestine. And this is why technically I think that the so-called exodus of the inhabitants of South Lebanon will remind everyone what is at stake. And I think that Hezbollah, given what had happened with it in the last 2 days, particularly the killing of one of its highest senior military commanders, or what happened with the pager attack, I think that now is the right time for Hezbollah to ask for help. However, and this is my personal belief, that Hezbollah does not understand the gravity of the situation. They still believe that the international community will put an end to the Israeli attack, while at the same time, simply they're hoping to, as we say, run out the clock. All of these scenarios are basically very tragic for anyone involved in the conflict.
Now, on the other side of the border, Israel has told its citizens to brace for intensifying strikes from Hezbollah after the pager attacks, which targeted its top commanders. What is Hezbollah still capable of?
Well, Hezbollah is definitely capable of driving the inhabitants of the northern cities of Israel down to the shelters. However, ironically here, you see that these people have shelters and have the ability to mobilize the healthcare system, whereas you look at Lebanon and you look at Hezbollah that claims it is capable of protecting Lebanon, and particularly the Shiites of the south, we see that civilians are fleeing their homes and they don't have homes to go to. Most of these people will either sleep on the streets or basically look for shelter with their relatives. Ultimately, I think that the people of the north of Syria are bracing themselves for a kind of an escalation of violence. However, in the case of Lebanon, the total collapse of the country, be it because of the war or because of the economic situation, makes the potential idea of an elongated or prolonged war a very tragic and very devastating on the people's psychological mindset as well as their physical well-being.
Now, these pager attacks have injured thousands, including civilians. Has that boosted support for Hezbollah in Lebanon?
Well, I wouldn't call it support. Many of the people who showed empathy or unity with some of these civilians that were injured did so because at the end of the day, these are fellow Lebanese. This doesn't really cross into supporting Hezbollah's Iranian war. At the end of the day, I personally felt empathy and did support and was willing to show empathy to people who were hurt, but in no way I'm willing to adopt the rhetoric of Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah, who sees that the only way forward is more destruction and more violence. And certainly the people of Lebanon don't want to throw Israel into the sea. We just want peace. We want the war in Gaza to end. Yet at the same time, we don't see that the continuing of the fighting in Lebanon, as Nasrallah and Hezbollah are promoting, is actually beneficial for the Palestinians nor for the people of Lebanon.
Now, talking about the people of Lebanon, what role is the Lebanese government playing in all this? Couldn't they de-escalate?
Well, the Lebanese government, contrary to the government we had in 2006, has no legitimacy whatsoever. First of all, it's a caretaker government, not to mention that we don't have a president. This vacancy in the presidency is basically one of the deadly sins of Hezbollah and its allies. Not to mention that at the end of the day, the Miqati government, Prime Minister Najib Miqati, is simply a kind of a puppet. And much of the rhetoric he's saying, he acts as if he's a sovereign prime minister. Yet at the end of the day, the decision for war and peace comes from Iran and doesn't even come from Hezbollah. So all of this has discredited Miqati and in a way has isolated Lebanon's political elite and made them a kind of a pariah. This is why now we have many regional as well as foreign actors trying to rush to Beirut to try to impose a kind of a ceasefire or potential reinstating of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. Yet at the same time, we don't have a credible government to actually see these ideas through.
Now, the anniversary of the October 7th terror attacks by Hamas is coming close. What effect does that have on the escalation between Israel and Hezbollah? Does it have any?
Well, I think this is an earnest reminder that despite the war might be coming to an end, or despite that Gaza has become somewhat thing of the past, we have entered a new phase of conflict, which is more devastating. Even the Israeli media is referring to what's happening in Lebanon as the third war, which means that we are entering a new phase in the conflict. The only difference is that previously in 2006, the majority of the Lebanese, including myself, bet on the idea that Nasrallah and Hezbollah will act Lebanese, and they have failed miserably in this. At the moment, there's no real betting on Nasrallah's Lebanese interests, and this is why ultimately I think what the Israelis are trying to do, other than bring back the inhabitants of the south back to their villages, they're trying to drag Iran into war, which doesn't bode well for the entire region and for global security and stability.
Why do you say that? Why would it be in Israel's interest to drag Iran into a war?
Because ultimately this idea that Israel is fighting Hezbollah is absurd. Hezbollah is one proxy in a series of proxies. You see that the Houthis have tried to join in, the Iraqis are trying to join in, not to mention that Syria is also actively, indirectly, by trying to encircle Israel. The Israeli military and intelligence apparatus know that there is a challenge to be addressed, whereas the direct challenge is Hezbollah. At the end of the day, the problem of the region rests in Tehran, not in the proxies which occupy many of these nations, including my own country. So I believe ultimately Netanyahu will try to do this on the pulpit of the United Nations General Assembly, remind everyone that the Obama doctrine and the whole so-called democratic, the democratic administration's insistence that Iran can be a source of stability has failed miserably. And this is why one has to go back either to conflict or a way of imposing sanctions. This would work.
Makram Rabah there from the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. Now let's look at some of the other stories.